Yeah.
Great.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the WRS seminar. Today we are pleased to have Joe Larson with us. He's currently the Associate Director for the Water Resources Center, and he focuses on the extension side of things and is a program leader for water. His background is very impressive. He came to us from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he was a top-level manager. He directed the Southeast Climate Hub at USDA and coordinated with University Extension and other science programs to provide science-related education on conservation planning related to climate change and water management. And before that, he was a Chief of Staff, Advisor, and Social Scientist in the Department of Interior. He is an alumni of the University of Minnesota. He has a Master's of Public Policy degree from the Humphrey Institute. And he has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography from Macalester College. So we're very happy to have Joel come and talk about laboratories to landscapes.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me here. What David didn't mention is that I'm the relatively new Associate Director at the Water Resources Center here. This is actually the end of week 4. So I'm going to rely on Les to heckle me when I get things wrong about the center, because he's also on the staff there, so he can help me out. So I did want to talk a little bit, just do a brief introduction, and then talk about this framework for research to use. How do we actually go about taking some of the work that's being done at universities like Minnesota and elsewhere and bringing that down onto the landscape so folks can use the information, the data, and the tools that we're working on here, and then feed that information back as well, so we can find out what data, what information is lacking, and start working on that in the research world. Talk a little bit about a way that can be done through the use of boundary organizations, which is kind of a field of study that's been around for about 20 years now. And use 2 examples. One, as David mentioned recently, I came from the USDA Climate Hubs, and then also talk about the Water Resources Center as an example of that, with the folks here come in for the welcome weekend so you can understand a little bit more about what that group does. And then talk about examples of how that works. So a couple of things on cattle heat stress, a tool called AgroClimate, and then more specifically water-related or rice irrigation mobile app, and really walk through this whole process to understand what that would look like from beginning to end. I had the pleasure a few weeks ago of seeing the WRS students do their 3-minute thesis presentations, or a handful of them. It was very impressive. The challenge with something like that is the amount of time you have is inversely proportional to the amount of work that you have to put into it. I'm not going to be that short, but I also know that I'm standing between this group and Friday happy hour. So I'll try to be concise and then look forward to some good discussion as we get further down the road. So David pretty much did this for me. I'm going to actually go from the bottom up. I'm a U alum here, so it's nice to be back. After I finished my degree program, I went to work at the Bureau of Land Management, which is a unit of Department of Interior, working in their social and economic analysis group. There were 2 of us, so it was very exciting among a staff of about 10,000. But they were really concerned about pushback they were getting for why they had so much resistance from, or resistance from local communities to their land use plans and to their research that they were trying to do in association with that. So that was my first kind of experience into this lens. From there, I went to the Department of Agriculture, so I was most recently at the Southeast Climate Hub. Before that, I was in their National Climate Change Program. And throughout all of this, this has been really the intersection of natural sciences, land use systems, and the human and social sciences as well. And so that part of it is a key component of what I'll talk about. So what's this kind of landscape, laboratories and landscapes framework? So I think a lot of you are probably familiar with at least some version of this idea that you start with basic research. It's very investigator driven. It's kind of how does something work? What's the basic process behind it? A lot of it's laboratory focused. That can translate to applied research. This is things like practical problems. So the cattle heat stress alert that I'll talk about a little bit later is a good example of how that connection can be made. The goal is really improving human and environmental conditions. So can we make things better on the landscape for people who are working on it, for animals, for the environment? And then it's often problem or client focused. So we have this issue that's out there, how do we address it? Or someone came to us, say at the university, and says, I need to do, we're a waterworks, we're a water treatment facility in southwest rural Minnesota. How do we start taking some of the excess nitrogen, phosphorus, other chemicals of concern out of the groundwater to help us do that in a cost-effective manner? So the next stage is kind of the deployment. This is where the extension piece comes in that I was talking about. Extension is kind of a formal framework for how that's done. A lot of people talk about it as outreach. Some people talk about it as education. But it's really the communicating the results and the tools and the information to the public, to the user groups. And then there's the actual use. So if you don't ever get to this stage, if nobody ever uses it, the tree falls in the forest kind of phenomenon. How do we actually make sure that the information that we provide through technology, through decision support tools, through practices like cover cropping or adopting energy efficient light bulbs, how do we make sure that that's actually adopted and useful and taken up by the people who are concerned about these issues? So there's a couple other pieces of this that I'm going to be talking about later on in the conversation. One is the education piece, so for the folks in the WRS program, and then also the policy environment. So what's this broader framework, things that are going on at the federal government, state governments, departments of the environment, departments of public health, that sort of thing. So it's all nice and neat when something's up on a board and you have a really simple framework for understanding how something might happen. The reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot of shared challenges that we face, not only between the research and the policy communities, but also within research and development, research and deployment and use. Sometimes those challenges are related to different or even conflicting missions. The big example that we talked about at USDA a lot is the risk management agency is responsible for providing crop insurance by and large to farming communities and farmers. And so they rely on actuarial data. They want to have these big data sets to understand how things like the use of cover crops affects crop production down the road. So they want to know if a farmer puts in a cover crop, if they provide them with crop insurance, they want to be not guaranteed, but pretty well close to it, that cover crop's not going to reduce that farmer's yield because they will end up paying the insurance policy on that. NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, is a branch also within USDA, and their focus, their mission is to increase the use of conservation technologies like cover crops with U.S. farmers. And so you've got this group that wants to push this out the door and onto the landscape. At the same time, you have a group like RMA that's by their nature and understandably a little bit more conservative with the adoption of that. And so you tend to get conflict. You can get conflict even within what you might see as the same organization. Another challenge is limited resources. This is the time and money argument. So you only have so much time, you only have so much money in your budget. And one of the challenges that comes with that is that not only are folks now being expected to do all of this job with the resources and the time that they have, but there's a lot of transdisciplinary work, a lot of cross-disciplinary work that's going on, and that in and of itself takes time. So there's more expectations with less resources that come along with it. There's the issue of not speaking the same language. Sometimes this is literally, but sometimes this is things as simple as what specific terms mean. So some people, I'm using the term applied research, some people use translational research. There's other terms like that that are thrown out. I just came from a meeting where they were talking about characteristics of wastewater. That was the term that was being discussed. And it was a room of water treatment, wastewater professionals. And we spent 45 minutes talking about what we actually meant by characteristics or characterization of wastewater. And so that piece of it can be where some of this conflict comes up as well. And for all of these reasons, there are few opportunities for feedback loops. So it takes time to do that. It takes resources. You need to be able to speak the same language, and you need to have at least a common understanding of what your mission and your cultures are, and hopefully come to some consensus about where you can go moving forward. So one of the ways, one of the frameworks that folks have come up with to try and address this is the idea of boundary organizations. And these are, as they're described, they're institutions that straddle the shifting divide between politics and science. They were originally set up as a way to help policymakers in that policy environment understand what's going on in the research community and vice versa, so to translate between these two. So when we have federal budget issues that are going on, are there ways that the research community can, one, understand what funding opportunities are available, and then also bring that back to Congress to show the value of this research as it's happening? The interesting thing about boundary organizations is now there's a lot of kind of discussion about within an organization or within a process, how can you use them to help break down some of the barriers between the silos that you often have in organizations like the ones that do this work. Silos are, as a former boss of mine used to call them, cylinders of excellence, if you wanted to make everybody feel good. So, as an example of this, I'll talk a little bit about the USDA climate hubs. These were established by the former Secretary Vilsack in 2014. It was a joint effort between the Agricultural Research Service, the Forest Service, the Farm Service Agency, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So the idea was to get these four agencies and all of our partner agencies within USDA to start talking about climate and how we can address this within our programs, and then also leverage partnerships outside of USDA. The boundary organizations, one of the earliest examples and one of the earliest places they were studied was actually with extension professionals at universities like Minnesota. Wisconsin was a big one as well. And so what we were trying to do was replicate that a little bit, but also do it within climate, because there were already groups out there doing it on cropping practices, on water management, but there wasn't really a whole lot happening in terms of climate. And so we didn't really have this cycle was basically broken. We had a lot of basic research, a lot of applied research being done at the Ag Research Service at universities like this, but we weren't necessarily taking that out and deploying it for folks to use. And so we stuck these hubs in the middle of all of these different organizations, not only within USDA to get agencies like Risk Management Agency and NRCS talking to each other, but also working with extension staff, with other land grants like the University of Minnesota, state and local groups and agencies, and to really find where there were common points of alignment on climate. So wanted to dive into a few examples of how this actually works and then tie it back to that process that I was describing earlier. One of the things we worked on in the Southeast is this tool called Searchlight. So Southeast Regional Climate Hub, locally something or other, and that's why acronyms are so useful because you don't have to remember what the whole thing was. But the basic idea is that users could sign up for an email subscription based on their specific location that provided them timely, relevant, and useful information. So right information, right place at the right time. We had a few places we wanted to focus, or a few topics we wanted to focus on. One was drought forecasting, so monthly drought alerts. Cattle heat stress is what I'll talk about in more detail. Pests, particularly on forests like emerald ash borer, and then fire weather conditions. So the idea is that a farmer or a fire manager doesn't have to go out and continually monitor this information themselves, but they sign up for a subscription and they get the information when they need it. So this is the cattle heat stress sign up web page, super easy. All they just need to put in name, this occupation, email, and then they pick their location. So you can zoom in on the map, figure out exactly where your operation is. And then what happens is that the Ag Research Service puts out a weekly forecast for cattle heat stress. And that information is put up on ARS's server, and our program here behind the scenes will weekly go out and ping that, figure out where there's going to be cattle heat stress or risk of cattle heat stress, and then send an email to all the people who subscribe to it. And that email includes the notification that this is forecast, and then management options, essentially. So moving animals to shade, providing increased water, all those sorts of things. But what this kind of simple interface hides is the complication of how you actually get that information in a useful and usable format, and make sure the information is applicable to the person. So starting on this side, the user gets, the person, the farmer, the ag manager gets the email alert. Great. But to get there, they had to find out about it through extension educators, through large animal vets, through our own staff as we went out there and tried to share the tool. But before we got there, we had a full-time web programmer and GIS manager who worked on this. So he had to be able to set up this page, so do the programming for that, but also understand how ARS actually stored that heat stress forecast in their servers and work with them to provide it in a format that we could use. We had to have the animal science folks from ARS on board, so they knew they were able to actually do the heat stress forecast. The nice thing was they were already doing it. They just didn't really have a way to get that out into the public. And the way that they were doing that was based on weather forecasting. So there were 4 conditions: temperature, humidity, wind speed, and cloud cover, essentially. But these are all tied to different aspects of applied and basic science. So we've got meteorology, understanding how those patterns develop, biophysical processes, computer science. And so what we found is that we weren't just moving this way, we had to be able to talk between the folks in these different fields as well. So another example of a tool like this is one that was called AgroClimate. This is a partnership that we had with the University of Florida and several other organizations. And it was a series of tools, a lot like the cattle heat stress, that folks could use, farmers, extension agents, others could use in the Southeast for things like rainfall and temperature monitoring. And the one that we really like to talk about, because I think it works really well, that's why it's an example, is the chill hours calculator. So fruit trees, other specialty crops, berries, things like that, need a certain number of cold in the winter for the fruit to set. And if they don't get that, fruit's not going to set, they're not going to have a crop. And so what we noticed is that as you would expect with climate change, they were getting warmer winters. And so this tool is just, again, a website, but orchard owners, so peaches, the example we used a lot in Georgia, can come in here and actually say, okay, here's the end of February, we have 664 chill hours. So they know for their trees, about 850 is kind of the lower limit that they need. And so if it looks like they're not going to get to that 850, they they've sprayed, they have other treatments they can do. So this is really a kind of a short-term use of this information. It's based on weather stations in each of these counties, and they can go and they can find this information, use it without having to look it up themselves from their own weather station or things like that. So it's something that short-term, season to season, they can rely on to help them make decisions about how to manage their crop. On the long-term side, we actually found this to be really useful too. So ARS has a fruit and nut lab, I think is actually what it's called, down in Georgia, and they do a lot of work with developing different varieties of peach and other fruit crops to respond to a variety of growing conditions. And so we shared this information with them as a way to show them that they really needed to start working on varieties that had that didn't require as much cold for the fruit to set. And so this is that minimum right here. This is the amount of chill hours over the course of the winter that you usually get, and this is the seasonal average. And so you can see that in the early 2000s, early 2010s, all of it was kind of starting to hover around normal for its 40-year seasonal average. But in the last 6 years, all of them were below that long-term seasonal average, and only one of them got to the amount of chill hours that were required for the fruit to set. So this potentially devastating for Georgia's peach economy. Anybody ever is from Georgia or been down to Georgia? So this is not Peach County, but there is Peach County, Georgia, and so they take their peaches really seriously, and with good reason, because they're really good. So with this information, the ARS staff were starting to look at lower thresholds for their chill hours. So can they develop varieties that only needed, say, 600 hours over the course of the growing season? So trying to find ways to address a very specific problem that farmers were facing on the ground and tying that information back to the research community. Third example is much more explicitly water related. Before I went down there, I didn't realize that Arkansas actually grows quite a bit of rice, but they're also facing a water shortage. And so the way that they had traditionally irrigated their rice fields is just flood irrigation, essentially, where they start, so these are levees that are set up along the contours of the field. They start up in the highest point, and they flood this section, and then it flows over to flood this section, it flows over to flood this rest of this section here. And the challenge with that is, one, it uses a lot of water. They don't actually need to flood all the way to the top of these berms for the rice to grow, but the way the physics work, they had to get over the berms in order for the water to flow down. The other is that it really, wasted any rainwater that came down. So if these berms were already full and they happened to get 2 inches of rain the day after they irrigated, they weren't able to take advantage of it because it actually just flowed right off the field because there was no freeboard with any of those berms. And so there is a technology that they can use to address this. And what it does is it places pipes along each of these berms, and they start off here, they go around, and so you can actually flood each field at the same time. It has the same rate of increase, and it saves about 25% both on water and on energy. And the problem is that the calculations for how to size the pipes, where to put what's called the outlets. So these are what the pipes look like. So these are set up along the berms, and they have these outlets that are sized. They start off big and they go small as you get further away from the well, from the pump, and the water pressure decreases a little bit. And those calculations were pretty complicated, and so they weren't seeing a lot of uptake of this irrigation technology. And so what we did in partnership with the University of Arkansas is we could put together a web app, a mobile app that actually does this. So they can so this was one that we did as a demo. They can literally trace their levees in the app. They can use data that they have when they made the levees, so they have to go through and plow them all out. And then this will automatically calculate the number of pipes, the number of outlets, where they go, the size, all of that for them, so the only thing they have to do is go out and buy it and install it. And so it was a way to take the barrier at that point, which is the calculations, and really reduce that for them. So again, this is kind of, with the mobile app, like the Rice app, the web tools like AgroClimate and the email alerts, this is all the front-facing stuff. But really where I think there's a lot of interesting work that's done is how do you move backwards from there? So how do you get this out in the ag and forest communities? And then how do you make sure that all of these groups here are talking to each other and actually feeding back to provide that information? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Water Resources Center as another example of this. This is where Les can heckle me if he chooses. But the idea is that a lot like as a boundary organization, we sit in the middle of these land use issues, human actions, and water resources. And so combining social, economic, and environmental sciences and informing policymakers and on-the-ground actors. A key piece of being a boundary organization is you have to have trust with any of the other actors that are playing a piece of it, because if you lose your trust, you lose your ability to actually influence, provide information. So anyone in soil science in here? That's great, because then I don't need to worry about being wrong. This is kind of this is the soil diagram. But this is kind of the idea of you can have sandy, you can have clay, and you can have silt, but in all reality, things are probably more in the middle here. And so we do a lot of outreach and public service, teaching and learning, and research and discovery. On the research side, organizations like ours, like the WRC, we do a lot of annual grants, both within the university and with external partners. So we fund folks to do research that we can't necessarily do ourselves. We do collaborative initiatives like working with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. They're really concerned about the road salt that's coming off of their plows when they go to get them washed. And so how can we work with them to understand both the science, what's actually happening, where is that salt going, and then what are the treatment options? So can they put in a better treatment system at their plow washes, that sort of thing. And then we do some internal research. So if we have questions that we're trying to answer, we have a few scientists and other faculty and staff on board that help us with that. The outreach and public service, we host several events. So there's research symposia that we put on. We also do policy engagement, so providing service on boards like the Clean Water Council and others. And then there's a whole section, most of what we do in this realm is in this training and certification and extension. So we provide trainings for septic system professionals to understand what the proper what the regulations are, what the proper equipment is to use. But like with all the other stuff we were talking about, that has to be grounded in the science of soils, hydrology, waste management, all of that other stuff. And then extension programming. So that's where we actually go out and do workshops with policymakers, things like that. Workshop policymakers. We do a lot of stormwater, working with stormwater professionals. And then the teaching and learning. So the training and certification programs are on here again, because that's part of this triangle diagram. And then the Water Resource Science grad program, so what you all are looking at. So you can see where some of this fits in here. There's nothing that's actually really, as a boundary organization, that we do. We don't do pure research. We don't do. We're not really ever on the edges of this triangle. What we do is concentrating on where we have our competitive advantage and working within that, in between these various pieces, these various corners of the triangle. So kind of coming back to this, and I think this is where hopefully there's some opportunity for thought among the students who might be considering a program here. What's interesting is that there is really a need for experience and knowledge in each of these pieces. So my personality, my learning style, the way I like to do my work, it's not suited to be in a lab. So I knew that that wasn't what I was going to be doing, but there are people who really get their energy from that. They love that. That's where their skill set is, and that's something to consider. As you move along this, and even between this, is think about, in my career, it's been important for me to think about where my passion is and where my talents are, and find that place in this process for it to work. And there is really a place for everybody in that, and that's been one of the exciting things about learning more. Even in the policy environment, this is where I came from. I'm really glad I did it. I'm kind of glad I'm not there anymore. But there is an absolute need for very high quality scientists who are willing to work in that field and can understand what the issues are, bringing some of those critical thinking, experimental design, and technical knowledge to a lot of the questions that are happening in the policy world right now. So something to think about as you're considering the program here. I think I'll wrap it up. I'm happy to take questions, and thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your welcome weekend. Oh, no. Either of you two, yeah, John.
I was going to ask about the difference between what was then and now as far as this emphasis. I mean, you pointed it last been doing stuff that has been related to, field stream.
Yep.
Booklet that you could report. I'm curious about what more emphasis, or how are things going to be different as far as this outreach? Is it going to be different? Are you just a new person on the block? I have a sense that there's going to be something different about it because of your background.
Sure.
I think unless you're a scientist,
you mean from what the center did previously, or?
Yeah, what the center was doing, and
sure.
Now is there going to be more of an emphasis that's going to be bringing in more of the policy and economics and all that? You see all these arguments about, well, I can say global warming, and somebody else can say something else about economics, and somehow you got to come up with a logical argument that doesn't just decide it's based on, well, I'm liberal, I'm conservative. And
sure.
I would be really excited to see that we use from that faith and
yeah, so let me go back to, actually, I'll use this one. So one of the things that I hope we can do is build on this piece right here. The center and the university, you mentioned the policy side. I think they're, as one of those trusted arbitrators, I think has a responsibility to ride a fine line between informing and advocacy, and there are parts of each that are important. So beyond that, though, I think that we have a water resources extension team that's working here, and they've been a little disconnected, I think, from the research community here. In my understanding, is at least from talking to them. So my hope is that they were really brought in as the Water Resources Center, being connected to the center, we can help them make the connection to the applied and the basic research communities here to help make sure that the information they're providing for this direction is actually grounded in the most useful science. It's interesting, being in the climate change world, we talked a lot about what you were just saying, that you mentioned the term climate change, and it actually, it elicits more of a, people can understand the climate science behind it, and people can be very scientifically literate. And you mentioned climate change, and it divides them into their political affiliations as opposed to whether or not they understand or don't understand the science behind it. And that finding in and of itself took a long time. This kind of work, Yale and other institutions have done climate communication to understand that that's what was happening. In a lot of cases, it wasn't just the need for more education, that's not on the slide, but that more education, but it was actually the idea that by using some of these very loaded terms, people were identifying on political and cultural affiliation as opposed to actually turning back to the science and their understanding of that. And so that helps us understand how to approach this piece of it. So that's what I hope we can do a little bit more of, making sure that we're connecting the extension, the outreach folks back to the science, not only for the ag, the water issues that we're dealing with, but also that human dimension piece of it as well, with the psychology, the social sciences, economics.
So what do you envision your sort of stakeholder network to look like?
Sure.
As you get started in this position, I guess that's kind of who do you see as people that you work with, people who would use your information that you're developing and things of that nature?
Sure. So I think some of it will look a little bit like this, and that's not just because where I'm coming from. But it's the research community within the university. They provide the research foundation, both here and at other institutions. It's understanding from organizations like the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. So those are the local government units that help direct a lot of this work or help inform a lot of this work. They're the ones who can understand what's happening in their particular watershed. And I'm not a visual person, so I apologize for going between these so often. But they're the ones who are going to be using a lot of this information. So finding out both what the information is, so what the content is, and the format that's most useful is going to be a piece of that. Board of Soil Water Resources, National Pollution Control Agency, those groups that have various levers on water issues across the state, and then as well as the individual landowners themselves, but to a lesser extent, because we don't really have the time or the resources to be able to go out and talk to every individual farmer, although it's an important group to be working with.
So, I mean, the stakeholders for water are pretty broad, and I mean, if you get outside of government, we have a lot of lake and river associations. Right. And have you had a chance to meet with any of those people yet?
I have not yet, but they've come up a lot. Some of our work so we have an extension, some of the folks on the extension team do a lot of work on harmful algal blooms, and so they're talking quite a bit with the lake owners associations. Yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to.
Do you have a goal of yours to bridge this urban and rural divide in Minnesota and water issues?
That would be great.
Yeah, do you have any insight on how we do that?
So, if we have a little bit of time, I'm going to give you a long answer on that one. So when I started at the Bureau of Land Management, one of the things that, one of those places we were seeing a lot of pushback from local communities was we would come in, do a land use plan. For example, they would say, okay, the range conditions in so-and-so Utah are really deteriorated. So we need to start pulling some of the cattle off that we had been letting graze there in the past. And we came in and we showed the local managers, this is the economic data. 2% of your economy deals with grazing. It's not. They would go out and propose this, and there was immediate pushback from the community. And they didn't understand it. At first, we didn't understand why that was. This is not, this is a small group. We can talk to them about how we might be able to change their farming models, their practices, their income models. And what we realized was it wasn't just the economics piece of it as well. These communities saw themselves as grazing communities, even though none of them, or very few of them, actually worked in grazing. But they were a ranching community, and that's how they identified it as part of their culture. And so once we addressed that fact, and this wasn't quite as simple, but it was a matter of building trust to say, yeah, okay, I understand, I hear you, that this is how you see yourself. That was really important, I think, for the Bureau and for us working in that field to see that there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen with some of that trust building. It's a really interesting, the rural-urban divide plays out at so many different levels because you have, say, so where I grew up in Iowa, they obviously there's the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit, all of this stuff that happened. That was also a rural-urban divide. Back when I was in DC, it was a coastal middle America divide, you could say. And so that plays out in a lot of different ways. I would hope that that's something that we get at, but it takes time. Not only, but it takes time. Like it's not something that's insurmountable. And I think that there are insights into those conversations that come from really interesting places. Recently, when they've started being able to do functional MRI studies to understand how your brain processes information. And there's two major types of kind of brain tissue. There's the older brain, evolutionarily the older brain, is responsible for fight or flight. That tends to be where a lot of the more emotional responses come from. And then there's the newer brain that's more recently developed in humans. That's where the logic center sits. And when they've done these functional MRI studies, they found that if the emotional center of the brain has a reaction, and it always reacts first, if it has a reaction, you cannot, the neural pathways won't let you logic your way out of that conversation. So that was the problem we were having with the discussion about economics in these rural communities. We were coming and saying, we were trying to logic them out of this conversation, saying, it's only 2% of the economy, it's not going to be a huge deal, don't worry about it. And it wasn't a logical reaction on their part, and it's tied to the physiology of the brain. So that's why I think it can provide some pretty interesting insights from other places, even within the university and the research community. But that sort of stuff, I think, can help give folks the tools when they're doing that outreach extension to address that. The other piece of it is time. And like I said, this takes time to be able to figure out. And when there are fewer resources, less funding, there's less time. And so I think folks like myself, others, can run interference more or less to try and provide a little bit of that and show them what the results are down the road. And there are tools that we've set up and programs that are already in place to help do that. One is the watershed specialist training that the center runs to help local decision makers understand the connections between their watersheds. So they have, I pull up the website later, but say you have, a community municipal water manager takes the class, they can understand what the hydrology, the geology of the soils are of their particular basin, and see that there is actually a physical connection to the agricultural communities 50 miles upstream. And to help make that connection in a way that makes it less of an us versus them conversation, and is more of a how are we going to deal with this as a watershed conversation. And it's tough because it's squishy, but it's a skill that I think we're going to need to grow, and I think we'll be able to grow.
When you were working with the climate up, you had to create some cultural differences there as well. Question climate change, that type of thing.
Right.
But you were able to successfully do that through some applications. You see a same sort of approach in the water divide between producers and
Yeah. So one of the ways that we found was, a process that was relatively successful for not avoiding the term climate change, but easing up on it so that you didn't have conversations shut down so quickly, was starting with a conversation with producers, and you could do the same thing, say, with a watershed, bringing the folks together who live and work there, and saying, what do you want your watershed to look like 10, 15 years down the road? And so it gets them thinking, okay, what's important to me? What do I value? What do I want to be doing? What are the things that I want to make sure are here for me down the road and for future generations? And from there, you can talk about, and what we tried to do is talk about, okay, then working backwards, what's the science for, here's where we are right now, here are the ecological conditions. It doesn't work on this particular slide, but what are the ecological conditions now? How does that compare to where you want to be 20 years down the road? And how do we get from here to there? And using, not just talking about data, but helping folks understand where the data comes from was an important piece of that. So you could have a shared foundation in the data and the information that was there. But eliciting from them what their vision was an important piece of that work, instead of us coming in and saying, this is what we think you should do.
Have you, do you think you will experience some trouble developing trust being associated with the university, and that there's kind of, this fear of academia and research sciences? But at the same time, did you experience that in government as well?
Yes, and so that can be an issue, definitely. One of the one of the other projects we did with the hub was actually here in the Ozarks region in Arkansas, Missouri, and there's a relatively large Hmong population down there that had started owning and operating poultry farms, and NRCS and a couple other agencies wanted to start working with them to understand what their conservation needs were, and then bringing some practices and information like energy efficient lighting, feeding, that sort of thing. And the way they had to do that was finding those trusted partners within that community that were willing to play that boundary organization role. So sometimes it was just one person, but they were respected within and trusted within the farming community, within that cultural community, and they understood what our role could be and understood the value that we could bring, and helped us understand what the desires and needs were for the Hmong farmers there. So that the boundary organization concept can be as simple as applying to one person, finding that trusted partner who's willing to be that divide. And that's the same within the, here and here and here within the research community as well, that there can be conflicts within a university, and they're all within Minnesota. So.
All right, well, let's give Joel a big hand.
Thank you.
And thanks for all the students who come for Welcome Weekend. I believe there's some refreshments outside that you can partake of, and hope you have a really great visit. All right.
Stay warm.
Yeah.
Stay dry.
No problem. I know. I'm gonna get those.
Yeah.
I think I just have to log off.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have been.
Oh, gosh, no, no. So, yeah.